football and Columbus Blue Jackets hockey. And starting October 1st, the Cincinnati Bengals. So
Woo!
I'm going to be adding that to the list.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Caroline Rice, who was in this class, and I'm just so proud of her, but go ahead.
Thank you. Like Nicole said, I'm Caroline Rice. Nice to be here with you all. Nice to see some faces. So I'm currently in my 6th year of covering Ohio State football and basketball. Also do radio shows on 106.7 and 98.9. Then I've covered a little bit of the Bengals as well, some high school football, and then do sidelining with BTM Plus covering other Ohio State sports.
Let's go to Craig Mertz.
Oh, wow. My book is in the background now.
That's amazing coincidence.
How did that show up? See if you can see it a little bit better there. Chill Factor. Yes. I co-wrote a book called Chill Factor with David Payson about the Columbus Chill minor league hockey team, which is going to be re-released as a paperback on November 3rd. So we're real happy with that.
Just in time for Christmas.
Yes, and the hockey season, maybe. So anyway, I worked 25 years at the Dispatch, mainly in sports department. Since then, worked with Mitch at AP, field level media covering soccer, national team, and MLS. Buckeye Sports Bulletin, I worked with them covering OSU hockey. And I usually stand on street corners looking for stories, and somebody will give me some money.
I got a tip for you. We'll take care of that.
Thanks.
Joey Kaufman.
Hi, I cover Ohio State football and athletics at the Columbus Dispatch. I'm still actually fairly new to Columbus. I've only been here since April 2019, so I've been here like a year and a half, and half the time I've spent most of the time in my apartment. I covered the guys last fall for the first time, and before that I used to cover USC and UCLA athletics at the Orange County Register out in California.
It's
a lot of college sports.
You're lucky you're not in California. You'd be better off be quarantined here. There's no fires.
Well, if you're going to quarantine an apartment, it doesn't really matter where you are, so you should go where it's cheaper to pay your rent.
Good point.
It doesn't matter where you live right now because you can't really do a whole lot.
And certainly not least at all, I'd like to introduce you to Matt Brown, who I am just thrilled to be here. He's also an alum of Ohio State. Matt.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm based in Chicago, but I went to Ohio State. I grew up in Licking County. I ran SB Nation's college blog programming for 7 years until this April when I got laid off on account of not having sports anymore. So I launched my own company called Extra Points, which covers the off-the-field issues that shape college athletics. It's a newsletter that covers the intersection of higher education policy and politics and finance and all these other issues that shape what everybody else gets to actually see on the field.
Awesome. Well, so I'm going to start. I'm going to throw out some questions to get us started, and I'm going to kind of select each person just to help with navigate the flow. But I definitely want you guys to ask your questions. So if you put them in the chat, then I will see them, and then I will call on you to ask them. But you know, I have to start by asking Joey. Obviously, you expected yesterday not to be sitting in your apartment. You expected to be covering Ohio State football, and Mitch expected that, and Craig expected that, and I'm sure Matt had some expectation of that, and Caroline, we all kind of did. So how are you adjusting to the fact that there is no sport for which you cover?
Well, it's dramatically shifted to basically you cover everything off the field. And I think that's where a lot of the stories are right now, either the planning phase of what is football going to look like when it comes back, either the protocols they have and checking whether the protocols are sufficient enough, checking on workouts that the team is doing while preparing to come back. And there's also then a huge financial component to the absence of games. If they don't play football, how much money could Ohio State lose, and what are the ripple effects of that? So it's the job has dramatically shifted from being all about who is going to be the starting left guard or who's going to replace Brandon Bowen on the offensive line or J.K. Dobbins to being a lot more about how does Ohio State athletics keep the lights on if they don't play football. I think that's been the biggest shift.
Hey, Caroline, you just mentioned that you did a radio show, and I'm looking at all of you who, except for Matt, I would have seen on a Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday availability. So it's not as much as it's dramatic that the sport is not happening. Even if we were in the off season, we would have still been seeing each other. We've been meeting with players. We'd be having coaches in front of us. None of that is happening now. So Caroline, how are you kind of doing your job without any real access to the people that help us do our jobs?
Yeah, it's very difficult. I think that's the hardest part about this whole thing is the lack of access. And, I will give credit to the communications staff for trying as hard as possible to submit email releases and information through that way. But it's hard. I mean, part of why I like what I do is just getting there and getting the information. So like Joey said, we don't know who the left guard, we don't know that stuff because we're not there. We can't see the team. We can't see them work out, practice. Can't get the sights and sounds of what's going on. So to me, just being so distant is part of the hardest thing, because we're just kind of getting things through email or through statements, which is not which is totally different than going to somebody and having a conversation, having a coach and a player there talking to you. So it's hard. It really just shifts from being there and gathering it yourself to kind of here's what's given and here's what you have to work with.
Maybe you could walk us through, Mitch and Craig, how it's given, because I hopped onto those pressers from the NHL, which were, I mean, they were challenging at best, maybe horrifying at worst. So how are you getting information now? And maybe you guys can all kind of share, Joey and Caroline and Matt, how you guys are getting your information now and how you're connecting with teams and players and coaches. Craig, you want to start us off?
Okay, I'll start. Yeah, I mean, it's all Zoom. Even when the Blue Jackets were in Columbus with their second preseason camp back in June and July, after practice, we would go up to a room that overlooked the ice rink, and we would sit there and we'd get in front of a camera and we'd ask questions, and they'd bring in players, and it's basically no face-to-face interaction with the players at all, which is something that is vital if you're on a beat. Especially in hockey, you have the morning skates or after practices, you go into the room, you can talk to the guys, you can see what's happening. You learn little tidbits about, are they changing their sticks any? Are they goalies getting new pads, things like that. You don't have that right now. Now the PR staff will get you one-on-ones if you need to, but generally we had, as Mitch will tell you, we had 4 or 5 guys and women, I should say, all media in one room. So you don't get any one-on-one, any personal interaction. And pretty much it sucked, but I think that's the way it's going to be. I think the NHL and most pro sports like it like that now. And we'll see how soon they go back to letting us into the locker room. It won't be for a long time.
What was it like for you?
Yeah, I would say, doing everything from my basement, which you see here, it's like Craig said, I think it's difficult when you go so many years of being a reporter and talking to people in person, and you get good at reading their mannerisms and their body language and the way they answer certain questions. And I think that the Zoom sessions put them sort of all in this distanced sort of situation, and they're not going to answer questions the same way they would if you were standing in front of them and looking them in the eye. So, I think we're getting different and probably not as good answers to our questions. And the other thing is, and Nicole and I discussed this before, I think that it sets a bad precedent, because I think some of these teams will determine that they like doing it this way because they can further control who gets to talk to the media and how long they get to talk to the media and issues like that. And we're just hoping that they don't say, hey, that worked pretty well, let's do that, let's do it that way, even when we do get access to the players and locker rooms and stuff like that again. So I don't know, but the days have been odd, and they've taken on kind of, we all got into this business because we didn't want to go to a job that was the same every day. And I think that the days have taken on a certain sameness, regardless of the stories that you're writing, and I just can't wait for it to be over.
You and me both. Well, Matt, your life has changed pretty dramatically with the things changing with COVID. Can you kind of walk us through the SB Nation evolution and an extra point? And I got my T-shirt, so I almost wore it, but I didn't want to seem like a fanboy. So
I mean, that's okay. I have your book right here. Like that's.
We should have done our mutual admiration.
Sure.
So tell us kind of the saga of that and really this evolution we're seeing in sports sports entities.
Sure. You know, and this kind of digs in, I think, into one of the questions here in the chat, right? When I worked for Vox, which owns a bunch of other media companies, this is an entity that's still primarily dependent on display advertisements to make money. More people click on a website, the higher your traffic is, then you go to the ad marketplace, and Budweiser gives you a little bit more money to stick a banner ad or something on there. And this is what Bleacher Report did, and this is what Sports Illustrated, kind of did as they tried to supplement their income from magazines and what a bunch of other digital outlets do. And when I started at Vox in 2014, SB Nation was by far the largest and most important part of that company. And then they really increasingly made bigger investments into political news and into East Coast culture. And they bought New York Magazine. And what happened, and unfortunately, this is, I think, a lot of people who've been in this business for a while have a story like this. You have senior management that doesn't really feel connected to the product that you're producing anymore. And they make decisions that emphasize other parts of that business. So what you're seeing at Vox is SB Nation mostly doesn't exist anymore. The pandemic accelerated that. I don't think it's the only reason for it, but I was a casualty for it in April. And then at that point, I had to make a decision because Chicago is a great city, and it is a city where I think there's some really exciting entrepreneurial media activity happening right now. But if I wanted to stay in sports, there are literally 0 sports jobs in this city. There's 2 newspapers. They're both really struggling right now. The Chicago Tribune's owned by like the worst people in the world in our business. And if I wanted to stay, I didn't have anywhere else to go. And I couldn't have gotten a marketing job or a PR job because there's a slew of reporters who have more experience than I am. And I can't move because I have 2 small children and a mortgage. So I realized I'm stuck. And I built a newsletter. I've been doing this for a while. I felt like I didn't really have a choice. Like, if I'm going to make any money and I want to stay involved in this in case anything changes, I got to strike out on my own. So in retrospect, starting a business in the middle of a global pandemic while you're also trying to run like an unlicensed kindergarten, because I have my 2 girls here too, not a great idea, but somehow it's still working. So my schedule is completely upside down. I'm doing a lot of my writing at night and as many interviews as I can at night, because during the day, sometimes I have to do dad things. And, to kind of, Joey and Mitch's and Caroline's point, like those struggles that you guys are experiencing with access, I think are even worse on my end because my beat is national. And so in the best of circumstances, it's really difficult for me to build some of that personal relationship with some of these individuals. If you're doing everything over Zoom or over the phone, sometimes they'll talk to you, but you're missing out on the ability to pick up mannerisms. You're missing out on that ability to build deeper relationship. And that makes sourcing harder. One thing that I've had to do for writing my kind of stories is I've had to develop sourcing independent of athletic departments. I talk to a lot of business consultants. I talk to a lot of academics. I talk to a lot of college administrators. I don't talk to a whole lot of coaches because if the coaches aren't talking to Joey, somebody that they're seeing every day, they're not going to talk to me or they're not going to tell me anything interesting. So I have to go completely somewhere else. And I think, unfortunately, that's what a lot of us have to do and what I think a lot of people in this class will have to do, because you're entering a market where it's been bad for a decade and now it's going to be even worse. So that means you really have to be pretty entrepreneurial, I think, if you want to see sustained success.
And I think that segues us perfectly. And Joey, I'm going to throw this one to you first. I've seen more quotes from parents about football players than I have in years. And that seems to be a new pathway for information. And in some ways I thought, this is great, because we've been sort of locked into the same pathways of getting information for such a long period of time of, you go through the SID and then you get coach accessibility with everyone else. And then you get these, for Ohio State football, we get a table and we get to all crowd around this one player. But now you're getting this creativity is kind of maybe inspiring us to get spaces occupied that we wouldn't. How's that worked for you so far?
It's interesting because I've always actually felt parents have been one of the best sources of info on college beats. I know Mitch talked about kind of the access being hampered in the NHL, but that's an average day in college football. You haven't had locker room access in 20 years, and the PR people pick which athletes they're always going to trot out to the media, and they always happen to be a fifth-year senior who has just an impeccable conduct record and just will be the best spokesman possible for the program. So a lot of these access challenges, college people have had to deal with for a lot of years. And right now, parents are being one of the better sources, just people being willing to talk and go on the record about stuff. But I think this has shown that you have to be able to pivot among your sources of information. You can't just be a reporter or a beat reporter and rely on coaches and players 24/7. You have to have, I think, a versatile or a diverse Rolodex in a way, where Matt mentioned business consultants or academics. You really need to, I think, to rely on a lot of people, and that'll help inform a lot of the things you write about, who's available to talk even, or who might actually have a lot of the best sources of information. Frankly, I don't even think coaches and players are all that valuable right now, because the people who are ultimately the decision makers in college athletics right now are the presidents and academics and people who are calling the shots there. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well, being able to be creative in who you contact for stories, being able to pivot and not just relying on who the team puts up on a Zoom call.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Caroline? Or?
Yeah, sure. I'll just mention, along those lines, you definitely have to kind of branch out more than maybe what you were used to, but it's also important to amplify the voices of the players and the parents during this time. So I find it really rewarding to kind of get to cover that a little bit more, to kind of share their stories. But as far as people in the athletic departments and at the conference, you also have to be careful with that, because nowadays I feel like everyone has a source, everyone has a different source, and that's why you're hearing a lot of misinformation. So you have to be careful with that too. Who knows what that's correct can be two different things. So really, it's also I'm finding myself having to make decisions on what I hear and kind of what I value through those people, because it very well could be wrong. Just because, again, I'm not there, I'm not that person. So you are trusting, really having to trust these sources that you're hearing, especially when it's such a big deal, like if there's going to be a season or not, for Ohio State specifically and for the Big Ten. You really have to be careful with that as well, and kind of weigh those sources, not just take any information that you can get as what's true, because we're all confused. And that's just how it is. But it definitely goes into your decision making.
Well, Mitch and Craig and, you guys cover just about every sport there is to cover. And we have a question in here, and actually, Chase, why don't you ask it?
Yeah, my question was for you guys that cover multiple sports, especially ones that are in the same season. Do you guys find that difficult to be covering different teams at the same time? Or what are challenges that you might think are associated with that?
I'll go first. Yeah, absolutely. I remember a few years ago, I was coming off covering the Crew, and the NHL season was starting. And it was my first year covering it for NHL.com, and I was just really deep in the Crew. And so I wrote something about there was a penalty in the hockey game, the Blue Jackets game, like 15 seconds after the opening whistle. And they wrote me back and said, there is no opening whistle in hockey. All right, it's called a face-off. And I knew that. I just didn't transfer from soccer to hockey. And then you also get the goaltender thing that you get every once in a while. So yeah, sometimes you can't remember what sport you're covering, what the terminology is. I do need a calendar to keep track of who is doing what and when. So yeah, those things happen where sometimes you're in a soccer thinking mode and then hockey comes up. So you get around it somehow.
I do need to jump in, though, that I have literally been sitting next to Craig while he's covering a soccer game from the Blue Jackets game, that he's covering both games at the same time. I don't
And
know
the
if
High
you
State men's basketball game.
and Ohio State men's basketball. So there's more to this than just messing it up, because it's rare that you mess it up, but you do literally in the same hour, you will cover 3 games.
My connection went back. Could you say that again, please? Just kidding.
If I could also add to that, there was a season, not last year, but the year before, that I was covering high school on Fridays, Ohio State on Saturdays, and then the Bengals on Sundays. And, of course, it's not just those days, it's the weekly availabilities, the practices you have to attend, and the work that's done outside of that. And that was probably the craziest thing I have ever done, especially with still being a student. That was tough. I mean, like he said, it's tough to kind of keep track of all the schedules, and you're at this and you're working on this. And it's tough, but it was also rewarding. I mean, the fact that I got to do all that much, I looked back on that year and I'm like, oh my goodness. Now I've kind of drawn back a little bit, not doing high school, and I'm covering the Bengals just rarely. But it's definitely rewarding to be able to do all those, even though it's challenging. You kind of look back and you're like, man, I did a lot of things that year that were really cool.
How do you navigate it, Mitch?
You have to be a good multitasker for sure. I have a wall calendar so I can kind of keep track of things, and I'm always trying to think ahead, because we have at AP we have a schedule for, if you're covering a game, then you're doing a capsule and a preview during the week, and there's just a certain pace. So it's it's busy, but certainly doable. The downside is, it's just impossible for me to cover Ohio State like, Joey does. I just don't have the time to do it. Because there's so much going on at the time, as you know, in the fall, after Ohio State basketball starts, then I have to, often I'll have games on the same day, and I'll have to go to my my invaluable stringers, Craig and Nicole, and cover hockey for me or basketball or something. And there are many times during the fall when there's an Ohio State basketball game and a hockey game on the same day. And I have to know that it's coming and figure out what we're going to do and make sure everybody's on the same page and all that. So that can be challenging. And I'm taking on the Bengals this year, starting in October, and I've never done that before, so that's going to be an additional challenge. And it seemed like it was going to work out great because there was no Ohio State season, but we don't even know how that's going to go yet. So
we're hoping you guys are going to give us the inside dirt on that.
Joey's got it.
Joey's got it. Alex, you want to ask your question to Matt?
Yeah. So Matt, you mentioned the difficulties about, building relationships. Obviously, the best opportunity to do that is with face-to-face interaction. In a time right now where the near future, we're really not going to have that opportunity. What do you see as the best or most personal way of building those relationships now?
It's a good question. And some of this, I think, depends a little bit on the kinds of the beat that you're on and the kinds of sources they're trying to cultivate. So I do a couple of different things. One, and I preach this gospel to every journalism class I get to talk to, like especially now, FOI was one of your best friends, because that is a way, especially if you're on a college beat, that's a tool you can use to get information when nobody wants to talk to you, because an SID.
They don't know what that is. Tell them what that is.
Yeah, that is the Freedom of Information Act, which means that you can file paperwork to inspect public records from any state entity. So for Ohio State, that means you can file a request to look at any football game contract, to look at athletic staff for performance reviews, to look at coaching contracts, to look at text messages sent from official cell phones or email addresses. If you've been following the Ohio State will they, won't they playing, There is an attorney that is grandstanding quite a bit right now about filing one of these requests. I promise it's not really rocket surgery, but anybody can do it. You don't have to be a journalist to do it. And that has been a cornerstone of the type of writing that I do, because I write a lot about financials. And so the information that you might see on an athletic department budget that's in the USA Today database, those numbers aren't necessarily the same thing that Ohio State might tell the Department of Education or the NCAA. And the way that we can figure that stuff out and what they're actually spending the money on is through FOILA. And that also informs the conversations that you're going to have with those potential sources. If you can come and you can bring receipts, and showing that you've done some of that laid work ahead of time, I have found makes it easier for people, makes it more likely that someone's going to talk to you if they haven't, and to build a different kind of relationship. So like in general, in a time where we can't just schmooze at the bar or hang out in the press box and develop some of those relationships or at practice, do whatever you can to get information that doesn't depend on those people. The other thing that I do on my beat is I really try to reach out to people who definitely have stuff that they want to say that don't get talked to very often. And this is another fun thing I think about being at a gigantic R1 research institution like y'all are right here, right? There are lots of doctors at Ohio State that have lots of opinions about COVID, about heart inflammation, about returning to activity, about lots of other things that would love to talk with you. We have lots of economists. We have people that study sports management. We have people that study higher education policy, and they follow this athletic department. They follow trends in the economy, and journalists typically don't talk to them. And so in my experience, if I call them up, a lot of them, one, they don't shut up because this is the first time someone's talked to them in a while, which can be great. And then when they realize that you actually are listening, they'll talk to you more. You know, those are some of I think the individuals that have reached out to me the most have been either, academics at studying sports management, or people who are involved in Olympic sports that just don't get talked to very often, which is a big issue right now. I talk to a lot of people in collegiate swimming, collegiate golf, collegiate track and field, because those are the sports right now that are being cut. So, for me, it's a tactical decision. Like it would be very difficult for me to try to become Gene Smith's best friend right now, especially because there's like 35 people on the Ohio State beat. And so for me to do that from Chicago, from a basement, while Paw Patrol was playing in the background, I probably can't do it. A better journalist might be able to. Like I'm saying, like that's a limitation for me. So I'm trying to zig where other people are zagging a little bit.
If can I piggyback off what Matt said too?
Absolutely.
Please.
Well, I think one thing about records requests, which is good, especially in this time, is usually records requests are something that is more concrete or something that has happened. And right now I feel as if a lot of the coverage of college sports is geared toward interviewing key decision makers and asking them what will happen. When will the season begin? Asking Jack Swarbrick, the Notre Dame AD, or asking other administrators or asking coaches. And those are all valuable because it's somebody on record giving their point of view or giving their expectation, and they have a say, but none of them actually know. Nobody's going to be truly predictive about when the virus trends are going to shift and when testing availability is going to happen and when state regulations might be released to allow teams to practice. And then can you go 6 weeks before? See, there's just so many hurdles, and I feel just an inordinate amount of energy has been spent on trying to do that. And I don't know what the value is in the long run, because eventually they're going to kick off a game at some point and we're all going to watch and cover it. But until that happens, I think there's a lot of value in trying to understand what is happening in the meantime and getting financial reports or getting just general protocol information. Like when Ohio State came back for voluntary workouts, I did a request for a COVID-19 waiver, things they had to sign, which was a Buckeye pledge, and that was discussed whether teams should have to have players sign those types of documents. And I think that's something that happened on a date and players signed it. And I think just giving people a sense of what is happening now and what is happening, concrete news, not just when will sports return, that gets very repetitive now.
I totally hear you.
I could not agree more. This is a good thing to keep in mind when you're asking people questions is what do they actually know and what can they control? Like, it's not breaking news that college football coaches would like to play college football. and many of them, I think in this profession are famous for not following or paying attention to anything other than football. Like there is a joke that if we asked all 130 FBS head coaches who the vice president was, I would put the over/under on people who legitimately do not know at like above 5, because they're so tunnel vision. So if you start asking those guys questions about public health policy, either they're going to give you a dumb quote, they're going to give you a Mike Gundy quote, which we'll all make fun of on the internet, or they're going to tell you something that's not really helping the reader. Like that's an important thing for you, the writer, to figure out is who's actually responsible for this kind of decision that everybody's asking. And then I should tailor my sourcing, my reporting, my questions to those people. I think we're seeing there's some, there are not specific to this beat, I think, but in general within college football, there are people that are realizing I can get attention and maybe make a little bit of money by kind of wish casting, by reaching out to people who simply don't know these things and printing them like they do and misinforming people a little bit. We should focus those energies towards the people who actually do, and then explain to our audience what that decision-making tree looks like. And records can help inform that.
Great. All right. Well, we're hoping, God willing, and we're all going to cover a game, right? Because that's what we do, is we're going to cover a game. We normally would be live, but we're doing it on TV now. So we're running the gamut here. So we have, as I mentioned, 10 people who are going to cover the NFL opener. We have people who want to cover the Crew or FC Cincinnati. We have someone who wants to cover MMA. We have someone who wants to cover motorsports. I think it was F1. So, especially those of you who have experience covering a lot of different sports, can you help us get started with coverage? How do we cover a game? And especially, and one question I see here from Aaron is, and what if we don't really know as much about that game, that sport, as we may wish that we did? So maybe, Mitch, can you start us off? You cover so many different games and different sports. How do you approach a football game, approach a hockey game, approach a soccer game?
I think preparation is key. I recently had to cover, I recently had to write the Islanders, Philadelphia, a couple of those games in that series. And I covered the Blue Jackets. So I knew some of the players from them playing the Blue Jackets. But I really had to go back and look at the rosters and look at the stats and spend some time with it so I can realize the significance of things that are happening during a game. Some of the Phillies' big guns were failing to score in the first few games and finally did. And, that was an issue that I probably wouldn't have recognized had I not spent a good amount of time, prepping for that game. And I would say, even if every Ohio State player and every storyline, you still need to spend time studying and Googling and looking at rosters and trying to pinpoint some of the good storylines.
That's great advice.
So I would say preparation is key.
So Joey,
I would agree with that. Sorry to step in there, but I think you have to have a base, and that's where you begin with any sport or any team activity. And I mean, going online and finding out, like I'm doing the MLS previews, and so I have Houston and Sporting Kansas City tomorrow night. How do I write a 300-word preview on teams that I don't cover regularly? Well, you go back, one, you look at the newspaper clippings, online clippings. Then you also go to the game guides, which the league puts out for each of the teams to get that background information. Switching gears a little bit. Now, if there's an event you're going to, like auto racing, I don't know a whole lot about auto racing, but Mitch has sent me up to Mid-Ohio to cover the Indy cars for the past few years. Obviously not this year, but so if you're going up there, one thing you can do is find people who know what they're talking about, know the people who know what's going on. And one of those was Tim May from the Dispatch. So I hung around Tim a lot. And so I learned a lot from him, learned more than I wanted to probably, but that's one thing to do. And if you can't get up there and you're covering it remote, again, go online, find the people, the respected people who cover the event, and just see what they're writing about, and get, don't stick to just one person. If you're covering teams, get both sides, get the home reporter, the visiting team reporters, and see what's going on. But first of all, just establish a base of information that you need to go on.
That's great. And Craig, real quick, and then I want to jump to Joy, but we have questions about soccer specifically and about covering a sport that maybe people aren't as familiar with. What are some of the secrets in terms of, and even if you guys could talk about the mechanics of coverage. So when you're watching a soccer game, it's, you know, the pace of it is different than watching basketball or hockey or football or any of those things. They all have a different pace to them and a different kind of style to which you would start writing. How do you do that with soccer specifically?
Well, the first thing in soccer is don't read the chat boards, the chat rooms. Number one, they're maybe the most brutal fans out there. They're freaking crazy. When I was covering it for the Dispatch, I just remember right before the season started, somebody had said, some lady upper deck or something put on the board, the Dispatch coverage is awful, it's terrible. They didn't have a single front page story on the Crew last season. I'm going, what? Never on the front page of the sports. They just didn't cover it. So I went back and out of 6 months, out of 180 days, I had like 83 front page stories on there. But you can't tell them that, you know. So number one, stay off the chat room. Number two, keep it simple. Again, think like somebody who doesn't know the sport. You don't want to dumb it down too much because you're going to lose your core readers, but go through the basics and just go from that point of offside. Well, in soccer, people still don't know what offside is because sometimes the referees don't know what offside is. It's such a complicated way that they do it, as opposed to just having a blue line in hockey to do it. But I think that this, in general, if you're writing a quick recap of a story, stay away from getting too involved in it and just stick to the facts as much as possible. Don't get too deep into it. Now, if you're writing a lengthy article, maybe a feature story, yes, you need to really, again, get that base of information to understand the sport and try to pass it on to people. But again, pretend they never watched soccer before. And if they haven't watched soccer before, how can you draw them into it? That's what the key is.
Joey, I think, you know, we often struggle when we've covered Ohio State sports because most of us here really love Ohio State sports. And I think all of you will agree that one of the hardest parts about being a sports writer is how differently you watch a game. So for those people who are going to watch a football game, what advice do you have for separating yourself from being a fan of a sport or a fan of a team and actually watching it with a critical eye that will allow you to report the important things that happen to the readers?
I think it's a little bit easier if you're trying to be cut and dry than if you're trying to give an opinion. But I think one way I always thought about it, because I used to cover USC and I grew up a USC fan, but I always viewed it as if I was a fan or living in a far-flung place or just a fan following the team, I'm there to provide the fans of this team an objective account of what is happening. And I think a lot of it just goes back to just if people couldn't watch it, or it's a little bit traditional, but just what is happening on the sidelines of a game, what is transpiring. And I think a lot of it, I think if you view yourself as sort of a conduit for people, a way to understand what's going on, I think you might have a little bit easier time.
So in terms of like scoring in football, I mean, are you chronicling every score? Are you looking for like pivotal moments? How do you kind of capture all the things that happen in a way that doesn't bog the reader down, but gives them as much as they need?
What I've always tried to do for a football game is bring binoculars and try and chronicle what you couldn't see on TV. I think that's a good way to think about it, is what can you give readers a chance to understand about the game that they wouldn't see ordinarily by watching it. And that could be something that happens on the sideline, the interaction between a coach and a player, something that happens after a big hit, something that says something that somebody tells you in the locker room or just in the press availability after the game. And I feel for everybody who now has to cover games off TV, because even if the access is bad after a game where everybody gets to talk to the same number of players, you could always hang your hat on, at least I'm going to have, my eyes are going to have a different camera angle than the camera angle that's on ESPN or Fox. Now that's taken away. But when you're in person, I think that's something you can really rely on. If somebody makes a big shot or a goal, I think learning to put your eyes on a subject's key. How do they react? How do they celebrate? Which teammates do they run to? Who do they hug? Who do they blow a kiss to? Just all that stuff that you might not ordinarily get on a TV broadcast is important. Because even if the access is bad, at least you can describe what happened.
Mitch, you've most recently covered things from TV. Has it been as Joey described, or how's it been for you?
Yeah, he actually described it very well. You know, and there's just a certain feel, probably everybody here has been to an Ohio State football game, and you know, there's a certain feel, there's a certain energy. The crowd feeds off of it, the players feed off of it, even maybe even more so at Blue Jackets games, because the press box is open and you can see how people are reacting to the plays. And you know, I think there's just a certain energy in the place that you absorb, and that helps you describe what's going on. I think watching it on TV, and you guys you have to do it that way anyway, because that's your assignment. But you know, I would say, and I saw a question from somebody who asked, how much should we discuss COVID? Well, you know, I think in the NFL opener, it's going to be huge, because there's going to be nobody there, and it's just going to be something that they've never done before. So, I mean, that could be a good bit of the story for the home opener, and that's the way it was when we started the Stanley Cup playoffs. But for the first couple games, you know, the players will talk about how weird it was to play in the empty arena, and but still have kind of the sounds that like when CBJ scored, they fired the cannon and all that. So it was just kind of this contrived atmosphere, really. And so, you know, that was an issue for the first couple of games, and then they got used to it, and we got used to it. We got used to not being there, and I think by this time in the playoffs, we're not talking about it anymore, unless there's a reason to, unless somebody tested positive or whatever. And nobody in the NHL bubble has tested positive, as far as I know. So,
Agree with you.
I don't know if they're gonna, you know, speaking of COVID, I the NFL are going to have issues. Just, they're not going to be in a bubble. There's so much contact. I just think that I think the season's going to be affected. I do.
Caroline, you know, we have the hovering on the horizon, the potential for NCAA basketball. They've already, trademarked the idea of the bubble. You know, what are some of your thoughts about how that coverage might take place moving forward, based on what you know from how we used to do it to how we're going to do it in the future?
Yeah, as far as a bubble, I don't know how that's realistic or going to work in a college atmosphere, just because they are student athletes. And even though not a lot of guys may have in-person classes or whatever that is, just the nature of how many different people you're around, I don't know how a bubble will really work for that sense. But in just terms of how different things have to be, you know, we're usually huddled around the players with our mics up, and I honestly can't even imagine going back to that after this, just because of how many people we were around, just thinking about that. But that's definitely going to be difficult, because you don't get that environment. But again, you see it work in the NBA. They have a bubble. But again, I think the difference with college really is that they're just different. Their lifestyles are different. They can do that. With college, the nature of college and intercollegiate athletics is the opposite of that. You're around students, you're around different people. And I think that's going to be very difficult for teams to do, just in the terms of how many different people you're around. I think that's definitely a big challenge.
No question. Hey, Matt, we have a question. Connor's asking us about the Heat Bucks playoff series and focusing on the bubble, but also focusing on free agency. And I'm wondering if you think, from your perspective of how sports is evolving, whether or not this kind of off the court or around the court story is going to become even more significant in our coverage, even of coverage of actual events.
That's a good question. I mean, in this kind of specific thing, I don't think it's an inappropriate question, but I also think you shouldn't be too upset if the guy tells you to bleep off or decides not to answer, right? Like you ask it because you know your audience is interested in it, but you also have to realize that the chances of getting that, you know, a really thoughtful quote or some big information about a free agency in a professional sport during the season, it's typically unlikely. But so much of this, I think it's hard to give really specific information because it depends on who you're writing for. It depends on what kind of story that you're writing, and depends on what your audience is. So for a story, like for me, knowing that my audience pays me money because that's all they care about are off the field issues. If I was covering a game, and I was planning on covering some games this season, I probably wouldn't ask as much about, you know, break down what happened there on 2nd and 8. I would ask more about some structural things, or I try to go talk to an athletic director or something. If you're writing a gamer, maybe, unless Giannis played terribly, but if your objective is just to chronicle what happened, maybe that's less relevant, and you should focus more on questions that explain what you just saw. What is a good question, and what I think a lot of that's dependent on your assignment, because ultimately you need to serve your readers and your publication.
No question. Well, you know, it's so funny. I mean, we're trying to talk about what we may go back to, and I know that we're not there now, but there are some big issues that you have to come to grips with when you get into sports writing. Among them, of course, is not being a fan anymore. And in fact, I enjoyed, among many things I enjoy about the press box, is the snarkiness that we have when things are happening. But we've also seen, like, I mean, I don't know if you guys remember, but during that Boston series last year, those Boston writers were like total homers. I mean, it was all about us and we, and it was very shocking to me. But this kind of understanding for people who are just entering sports writing about what the expectation is to not be a fan, to be objective, even though you spend a lot of time with people in very closed environments, you know, under normal circumstances. What kind of advice would you have, you know, to start off with? And, you know, maybe Craig, you can start us with how you separate yourself from being a fan of a sport or a team to the coverage that you provide, and how you make that mental shift.
Yeah, I think one thing in my situation, not only separate yourself being a fan, but I also try to separate myself from who I work for, which sounds a little bit weird, but I work NHL.com. I work for the league, and we have standards and things that we can or can't say. Which, as a journalist in my years, and you know, working for a newspaper and all that, it's tough. I mean, we can't talk about fighting in a hockey game. We just don't do it. Unless there's a serious injury comes out. We don't talk about there were 3 fights in the first period. We're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to be critical about the NHL. So I have to separate myself from, geez, this is what I really want to write. And so I'm a shill for the NHL in that regard. But then I'll go work for AP. I got to put on a different hat, and I'm just, you know, a straight reporter. I think that's really the most important thing for me. One thing that Mitch mentioned early on about is getting information from teams. I think the biggest drawback or hurdle for us as journalists, reporters in the future is going to be the team websites, one, and then two, things like the Players Tribune. Players are now in a position where they totally control what information can get out there, and you know, they set the narrative. And I think I'm sure everybody else will want to talk about. That's the biggest problem for us is going to be in the future. Like you mentioned, free agency, Matt. They're the ones that are going to set the tone for what they say and can't say, when they say it, who they say it to. And unfortunately, the general reader will see something on a website, a story about somebody, a very glowing story when it shouldn't be. They think that's real journalism. And there's a separation there between real journalism and work with somebody. Again, unfortunately, I mean, I work for the NHL.com. I'm not a fan of a team. I'm not a fan of, you know, the Blue Jackets or the team that I'm covering. But I do have to remember that I'm working for the NHL in that regard and try to write a story from that angle. And it is a little bit of it in terms of not being a real journalism. I hate that aspect of it, but they pay me pretty well.
But it seems like
So I'm a shill, you know, so I got to do it.
Mitch, you're going to say something?
Did somebody else start talking? Go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, it's just me. So just.
Oh, okay. The AP and I think most sports writers, you know, have an attitude of covering gamers of, you know, I don't care who wins. I don't care. And I would prefer a blowout so that we can get most of the story written and we don't have to scramble at deadline sorting out overtime or a win on the last play. I don't care who wins. I honestly don't. I just, I want just no overtime. No overtime.
I told them I root for me, which is let's get at this.
That's right. That's right.
But so Joey and Caroline, I was hoping you guys could kind of, you're on two sides of things, right? So Caroline, you are more focused on people who are fans and they have an expectation that you will be more subjective, where Joey, I know that that objectivity is your goal, but yet I'm guessing you get criticized a lot for that because dispatch readers feel like, if we're not saying good things about the Buckeyes, then we're not doing our job.
Yeah, so I'll start. I mean, I guess just growing up in Columbus and going to Ohio State, obviously, I was a fan. And, when I started, I was very young. I was 16. I just turned 17, and that was hard to get out of, growing up a fan and knowing that I was going to go to Ohio State. I still do. I go to the law school here at Ohio State. So it's hard, but you kind of have to wear two different hats, and you have to separate yourself from your job and for what you're doing. I always say, when I say I'm a reporter, people say, oh, it's like, well, that's what I do. That's not who I am. So I separate the two. And, but I do keep in mind that, when I'm covering Ohio State, I write for the Ozone. We're a site that just covers Ohio State. We just cover Ohio State football and basketball, other sports and recruiting. But so my audience is Ohio State focused. And when I do write critically of Ohio State, I hear from the fans, I hear from the people that they don't like that. But again, that's my job, and you just kind of deal with that. But you also have to keep that in mind. To please your audience, you have to write things that are positive about the team, even though I say in my head, there's a story that I want to write that's very critical. Probably going to go with the one that's more positive of something that happened or a player that did something well in the game, because that's what fits the audience, and that's what the Ohio State fans come to our site for. So keeping that in mind, but you still have to separate yourself from really what you do and kind of what you put into your writing. It has to be different.
I think there's still, I know, Nicole, you mentioned a lot of readers of the Dispatch, or people want to feel good about the Buckeyes. I think there's a large segment of readers in Columbus too, who probably would say that Ohio State tends to get glamorized and there's not enough critical coverage in general. So I've found sometimes you write things that get positive feedback, even if they are critical. Certainly you'll get some of both, but I find a lot of readers do look for that still. I remember when Ohio State hasn't released their testing data for college athletes and football players, which is they rave about how great their protocols are, but they haven't really showed us the proof in the pudding. And we've written about that and pointed out how that runs counter to what infectious disease experts would recommend. You should be transparent and say, if you are returning to sports, tell us what your results are. And I think people were mostly receptive to that line of thinking or story. And so I think that's important to keep in mind too, that as much as people may look for you to pump up the home team, people do want some critical analysis or just pushing back on conventional thinking.
Absolutely. Alex, you had a great question about the merger of sports and social justice.
Yeah. So taking into account over the past few years, sports and politics or social justice have really merged together into one, as well as, taking into account how politically polarized, this society is right now that we're living in. How do you go about reporting on politics without alienating viewers that have or may have opposing views?
I'd like to talk about that, if that's okay.
Sure.
For one, I think this is a conversation that you're going to want to have continuously with editors and people at your publication, because the unfortunate truth is in America in 2020, you literally are not going to be able to write about anything even kind of related to this without getting criticism, without alienating some people. And a lot of that criticism is going to be bad faith, right? It's people who have no interest in trying to play dispassionate journalism critic, but just because they see something that for some culture war, for whatever, are going to criticize you. So if you're going to talk about this at all, I think you want to know, to what extent is my publication and my editor and my staff going to back me up? And unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, the answer is probably not very well. And so the initial impulse for the writer or for the editor is, how can I touch this stuff as little as possible so I don't get screamed at on Twitter for 14 months or lose subscribers? And I don't think that for all beats and for all stories, that is something that you can do. So for the approach that I take with my audience and my publication is I have a little bit of a different opinion about how objectivity works than maybe you might have learned here, because I don't believe it's possible. So I tell my audience, like, hey, this is where I'm coming from. So you have an idea and can judge what I'm going to tell you here, and these questions I'm going to tell you here through, and here's how there might be shaped by my own personal experience. And then what I'm not going to try to do, I'm not here to try to be objective. I'm going to try to be fair. I'm going to try to be accurate. And so you try to get quotes and perspectives from people, even if that isn't necessarily your own, so you can chronicle what they're thinking. But you can't ignore it. I realize that maybe not everybody gets into sports writing because they care about politics, and there's certainly a lot of people in our audience who want very badly for sports to be completely separate from politics, to be a oasis from politics, a distraction. But I'm sure, as Nicole has shared with you, sports are a part of society, and so they're going to reflect part of society. And if we ignore that completely, we're going to tell less accurate, less interesting, and engaging stories.
No question. We just have a few minutes, so I do want to, Maria, I wanted you to have the last question here because it's such a significant one. Would you mind sharing your question?
Yeah, so basically with those of us graduating this semester, next semester, just sometime soon in the midst of all of this, that do want to get into the sports field, how do you anticipate that difficulty for us for entering the field, just because it's hard enough to find a job without all this going on, especially in the sports industry. So I guess, how do you anticipate that for us?
Or what's the best advice you have for them that maybe could help them kind of jump in this space? Joe, you want to start us off?
That's tough. I guess I'll tell you about my personal experience. My dad is a dentist and has no connection to sports journalism or newspapers at all, and I went to college right after the Great Recession and came out in 2013, and it seems like the industry's only gotten worse since then. But from as I understand it, the economy is pretty tough in a lot of fields right now. So my dad's response is, well, I don't know what I would really recommend you do or go into. So that's my experience. I think it's going to be really hard because there are fewer and fewer local news places and local journalism outlets. I think that makes it tougher. And I think a lot of the digital media outlets, Matt talked about SB Nation and Deadspin, a lot of those have been really hit hard or gone away. So I don't have a lot of great answers, to be honest.
I think my advice would be just keep perfecting your craft and keep working on what you do. People always say control what you can control. And right now we can't control this. None of us can. That's obviously going to be difficult. I don't want to downplay that, but I think you should kind of take things into your own hands as much as possible. Work on your craft, study the game. If there's a sport you want to cover, study the game, study, as much as you can, learn as much as you can, talk to people, connect, network, really just all those things that you can do. Don't just sit back and kind of wait for a job to fall in your lap, because in reality, that's just not how it's going to work. So I say my best advice is really just to keep working on you and perfecting your skills. And when the time comes that we're, this is kind of bouncing back more, you're ready and you're the best candidate and you can show that and prove that.
I would say that sports writing jobs are scarce, and I think that's probably going to be the trend. Now, that said, there are a ton of websites out there that need content, sports websites, and you may not be able to slide out of college and get a full-time job with healthcare and 401k, but if you really want to be a sports writer, I think that there are opportunities. I don't know, you may have to do it for little or no pay for a while, but if that's what it takes to prove that you can do the job, that's what you might have to do. and then just try to be indispensable at that point. But you know, people need content, and there's more websites all the time. I think there's probably more websites covering the Buckeyes every single year that I've been on this beat. So I don't know.
Here's what I'd say, and I hate to be Debbie Downer about this, but like the truth is, you're right. There's not very many of these jobs. The jobs that do exist will almost certainly not be in Columbus. So if your goal absolutely is I want to be a working journalist, you're going to have to move. And you have to ask yourself, am I okay working in the Interstate 95 corridor between, you know, New York and DC, where the cost of living is astronomical? Am I comfortable, you know, throwing 4 people in a townhouse in DC to work for $38,000 a year? Or is it more important to me that I stay in the Midwest? And if it is, then you might have to make other adjustments. The other unfortunate thing about it is that it's not a meritocracy. Because there aren't very many of these jobs, this is one of the few industries, I think, it's still in 2020, where you went to school matters, particularly at prestige outlets. And while Ohio State's awesome, it's not Medill. So you're going to be at a disadvantage if you're trying to get a job at the Washington Post or the LA Times, the Wall Street Journal, because there's going to be a bunch of Ivy League kids who had different opportunities than you that will compete for those. So you have to go into this wide open, right? The only other thing that you can control, besides being willing to relocate and do, you know, garbage work for garbage money, is developing something that you can do that other people don't have, right? Unfortunately, there's a gajillion people on the internet all over the country who think they can write gamers, or at least are going to be willing to write gamers for $50. And so being the absolute best gamer writer at 22 it's going to be hard just because there's so many people. But if you have whatever other skills you can put in that toolbox, whether that's video editing, whether that's open records, whether that's audio editing, whether that is data visualization, if you have any kind of coding experience, any kind of technical experience, these are the things that help you. I don't have a journalism degree. I only got into this industry at all through the back door through kind of dumb luck, in part because I had a skill set that was independent from other journalists. And when I look at the other people that I worked with at Vox who have left that are now have more stable careers or been able to build things, most of them didn't go to J school, but they had computer science backgrounds, they had legal backgrounds, they had backgrounds in a particular field. And I think that's the only thing you can control, because if you have subject matter expertise and you're curious, you can build something yourself. But the kind of stable pathway that we're used to be, where you'd go cover high school sports somewhere for a little while and work your way up to a bigger market and have something resembling a 401k, it just doesn't exist anymore. And it sucks, and it's bad for communities, and for us, but that world just isn't there.
And I just want to let you guys know that one thing we are going to explore moving forward is a little bit what Craig talked about team journalism. So that is another area that's opening up that we're going to have to see where that evolves, about this kind of fan sites, and also teams have their own journalists that they hire now to do the work that newspapers and websites used to do. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we're going to talk extensively about career opportunities there. All right, we are out of time, and I want to thank everybody who joined us today. We have little reactions down here, so let's give them claps. And Matt's giving his information, Caroline's given her information. I will make sure that you have emails to get in touch with everyone. Please follow them on Twitter. Please follow their writing. And if you guys have thoughts, I'm sure that they would love to hear from you. But thank you so much to Caroline, to Joey, to Mitch, to Craig, to Matt for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I'm thrilled that you shared your time with us. So thank you.
Thank you.
All of you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll stick around for a little bit if anybody wants to talk about covering their game, especially if it's something that's coming up soon. But if not, have a wonderful 3-day weekend. Please be safe, you guys. Just mask up and don't do things that will prevent us from being back together again next week, because I would really miss you if I didn't get to see you every week. So have a great holiday weekend, and I will see you on Wednesday.
Thanks for having me. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Thank you again so much.
Thanks, Caroline. Let's talk soon.
Yes, please. Please take care.